I want to begin with a truism, which is that circumcision defines the Jew. But of course, circumcision, and in this term, we're thinking about circumcision meaning infant male circumcision, is not at all just a Jewish practice. It is, as most of you know, widely practiced. The Egyptians had teenage male circumcision, and many, many other cultures have other forms of the surgical or mechanical alterations of the genitalia, both of men and of women, and I'll come back to that. But I'm going to make an argument that circumcision is a problem in societies which define themselves as non-circumcising. That's going to sound like an odd notion. You know, why would the world define themselves into circumcising societies and non-circumcising societies? I'm going to make an argument that circumcision comes in the societies that define themselves in opposition to circumcision, to have a very special and specific role. We can start by examining this very early in Jewish history. As you know from a book of the Maccabees, one of the reasons that the right-wing fanatics who rebelled, right, the Qaeda of its day, was that the Jews who were Hellenizing had removed the marks of circumcision, and thus abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. Josephus notes it about the Maccabean rebellion, wherefore Menelaus and the sons of Tobias desired the king's permission to build them a gymnasium at Jerusalem. And when he had given them leave, it's not gymnasium, by the way, it's a gymnasium, right? LA Fitness, naked guys. When he had given them leave, they also hid their circumcision of their genitals, that even when they were naked, they might appear to be Greeks. Hellenistic Greek culture was a non-circumcising society. That does not mean that they did not circumcise. But what it does mean is that they saw circumcision as an abomination. The body for them, the male body, was perfect in its beauty, in its aesthetic perception. The Jews who were circumcised and wanted to Hellenize had to hide their circumcision, had to remove the signs of their circumcision. And they turned to what else? They turned to medicine. And so the first aesthetic surgery was, in point of fact, Celsus's decircumcision operation. This is before the age of antisepsis. This is before the age of anesthesia. It was a reconstruction of the foreskin. Now you have to understand then the cultural power of an anti-circumcision society that drives the circumcised to reform and alter the forms of their genitalia. Now this idea of the anti-circumcision society becomes part and parcel of the discourse of the West. And there are four views of the problems of circumcision in connection with the Jews, which have dominated Western thought since the rise of Christianity. because Christianity inherited the Hellenistic view of the practice of circumcision. Following the writings of Paul, the first saw circumcision as inherently symbolic and therefore no longer valid after the rise of Christianity. It was a Noahide law pertaining only to the Jews, and therefore it was not universal. Christianity was universal. Christianity had the Hellenistic notion of the perfection of the bodies. The Jews did not. And this view was part and parcel of the views of the church fathers, of Eusebius and Origen. It continued through the Renaissance with Erasmus and through the Reformation, by the way, to Luther. And it forms the theological basis for the distinction which Christians were able to make between their uncircumcised bodies and the bodies of the Jews. An absolute difference. Kant notes in his Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, the subsequent discarding of the corporeal sign which served wholly to separate these people from others is itself warrant for the judgment that the new faith, Christianity, not bound to the statutes of the old, nor indeed to any statute at all, was to contain a religion valid for the world and not for one single people. Circumcising people, parochial; non-circumcising people, universal. This becomes part of the second group of arguments about the meaning of circumcision. Positively, Spinoza thinks of this as the sole sign of Jewish group identity. He says the sign of circumcision, this is 1670, is, as I think, so important that I could persuade myself that it alone would preserve the nation forever. But the liberal Italian physician, Paolo Mantegazza, in a set of books which were sort of popular handbooks of sexuality, writes in the 1870s, circumcision is a sanguinary protest against universal brotherhood. And if it be true that Christ was circumcised, it is likewise true that he protested on the cross against any symbol which would tend to part men asunder. The Jews, according to Spinoza, the Jews, according to Mantegazza, become a community for good or for ill because they circumcise. Now, there is a background to this which has to do with the notion then of Jewish character. Circumcision is then read by non-circumcising societies as a sign of the primitive nature of the Jew. J.H.F. Autenrieth, in his Rektoratsrede of 1829 in Tübingen, saw circumcision as a primitive act practiced by culturally inferior people such as Jews and African blacks. Circumcision was a surrogate for human sacrifice. This becomes a truism, by the way, in modern anthropology. John Lubbock in the 1870s saw the rite as one of the symbols of human sacrifice, which at one time habitual among the Jews. So the Jews don't kill their children anymore. It's a good thing, but they just cut off part of their bodies. Not great, but better than killing the children. Now, what's interesting to me about these arguments is that they have something to do with the notion of the construction of communities, the construction of identity, right? And something about the character of the people who live in these communities, right? The fourth definition is one which I find extremely interesting because it comes out of this conflict between circumcising and non-circumcising societies. And that is that circumcision is a form of medical prophylaxis. It's what I'm going to call the health exception. And it only arises, I'm going to say this again, it only arises in the conflict between circumcising and non-circumcising societies. It is never part of the originary discourse of circumcision among the Jews or anybody else within circumcising societies. Thus, we're back to Hellenism. Philo, writing in a strongly Hellenistic culture that did not like circumcision, as we know, claimed that circumcision was a prophylaxis against diseases of the penis. It was a prevention of a painful disease and of an affliction difficult to be cured, which they called a carbuncle. But it also promoted the well-being of the individual and assured fertility. And this idea echoes through modern medicine in non-circumcising societies, right? So that William Osler, who is you always call the father of modern medicine doesn't seem to have a mother, in 1924 observes, we may go to Moses for instruction in some of the best methods in hygiene. Now, we've now sort of come, I think, to a juncture, I hope, which is there are circumcising societies that circumcise. They circumcise for religious reasons for the most part, I would say almost exclusively, and religion, of course, is a very fungible concept. When these societies come in conflict with and contact to non-circumcising societies that see the practice of circumcision as an abomination, suddenly we get the health exception. It isn't that it's just religious practice, it's also healthful. Okay? Now, I want to also stress that this notion that circumcision is a sign of this group identity and the character of the group is important, and how this health exception becomes part and parcel of a discourse which leads up to the Cologne findings. Circumcision becomes an immutable mark of biological Jewish difference in such non-circumcising societies. In the Enlightenment, Johann David Michaelis, the noted Orientalist and the great opponent of Lessing, noted that it is true that the Jews, like the ape, can be born circumcised, apatheistic. But Michaelis interpreted this anomaly in no way as a sign of the higher status of the Jew. The idea is the inheritance of acquired characteristics, right? If you build muscles, your kids will have big muscles. If you circumcise your kids, your grandkids will be born without a foreskin, which is a very old-fashioned Lamarckian notion, which modern genetics, by the way, has reintroduced and probably is partially true, which is an interesting problem. For Michaelis, living in the midst of a world which firmly believed in masturbation as the origin of a myriad number of physical and psychological ailments, circumcision had no curative powers to reverse or prevent illnesses due to masturbation, because this was one of the health exceptions. You circumcised your children so they would not masturbate. Circumcision, he states, is not a cure for masturbation. The Jew, Michaelis notes following Philo, claims, and ironically following Philo, claims that those born circumcised for especially holy men, since they have a diminished sexual urge, but we, wink, wink, right? We imply, he implies, we know better, because we know the Jews are all hypersexual, Jewish men at least. On the other side of the political scale, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, the great liberal anthropologist of the Enlightenment, argued for the existence of congenital circumcision in his study of the sexual drive of 1781. If Jews and others circumcise their children, it is reasonable to expect that some boys in the Orient are born circumcised. And this becomes a kind of a trope in German, and you know this from Die Räuber, because when Schiller introduces Moritz Spiegelberg, whom we know as the audience is Jewish, but who denies he's being Jewish, Spiegelberg says, you know, I'm not Jewish. I was miraculously born uncircumcised. I was born circumcised, right? So there is a kind of a popular understanding that this is a kind of a running joke. The Jews are born circumcised. The Jewish males are born circumcised. Now, Darwin goes back in the variation of animals and plants under domestication in 1868 to Blumenbach. And he does something which now becomes a trope in the 19th and 20th century. He goes to Jewish medical science. Now remember, this is a non-circumcising society coming out of Christian, Pauline, and then Hellenistic notions that circumcision is an abomination. He goes then to Jewish scientists, 3 medical men of the Jewish faith, that circumcision, which has been practiced for so many ages, has produced no inherited effect. Jewish little boys are not born circumcised. Blumenbach, on the other hand, as we know, argues that they are, and that they even have a term for those born circumcised. Now, the Darwinians, and I'm going to quote here Hastings Tweedy, the president of the Section for Obstetrics of the Royal Academy of Medicine in Ireland in 1920. He'll come back in our arguments. He said that he had never satisfied himself that the craze for circumcision, which had begun in the 1920s, was justifiable. According to the laws of evolution, the foreskin must have been greatly needed by the human race, or it would not have persisted. But one of the things I think we're catching on is at the end of the 19th century in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Great Britain, and certainly in the United States, circumcision is a hot topic. And it is expressly and specifically connected with the Jews. In the leading German pediatric journal in 1872, the comment is that the circumcision of Jewish children has been widely discussed in the medical press, as is warranted with topics of such importance, but is usually discussed without the necessary attention to details and the neutrality that it deserves. Indeed, it has not been freed of fanatical anti-Semitism. Because by 1872, within European Jewry, circumcision was one of the topics up for reform. In 1843, as a response, and boy, this sounds like Cologne, doesn't it? As a response to the finding of the Public Health Authority of Frankfurt that circumcision had to be carried out under medical supervision, the Verein der Reformfreunde said that the Brit Milah was neither a religious obligation nor a symbolic act. With the expanding role of medicine came further opposition. Certain aspects of Jewish circumcision, such as mitzitza, the drawing of blood from the circumcision wound through sucking, which will also come back at the end of my talk, were deemed unhygienic. Outbreaks of syphilis and tuberculosis from 1805 to 1865 were blamed on ritual circumcisers, on Mohalim. And many reformers who wanted to preserve circumcision advocated mitzitza to be done using a sponge or a glass tube. The case, and we can look at the circumcision records of the communities in Vienna, which I've looked at in detail, and in other German cities, from the 1840s on through the 1933, circumcision became less and less practiced, even among practicing Jews. Okay, not abandoned, right? Not abandoned, but less and less practiced. But I want you to note what has happened here, which is here we have now a religious practice that comes in conflict in a non-circumcising society with science. And I'm going to stop for a moment, because that sounds to you like it makes sense. It doesn't. Aspects of the public sphere create their own standards for evidence and for proof. I'll give you an example. A person commits a terrible murder. He's examined by his psychiatrist, who finds that he is severely schizophrenic. He gives him a medical diagnosis of a specific psychiatric illness. There's a trial. That psychiatrist is called before the court as a specialist witness, but he is asked only about whether or not the person can distinguish between right and wrong. Medicine has its standards, its definitions, its ambiguities. The courts do not permit that. There are different standards of evidence. What may be crazy in medicine is not crazy in law. What may be healthy or unhealthy in medical science may have absolutely nothing to do with ritual practice. When you move from one sphere to the other, what you're doing is using the power of the rhetoric of the more accepted, powerful part of the society. In the 19th and 20th and 21st century, medicine, to comment on what is seen as a more traditional and less powerful aspect of society, the creation of communitarian identity, religion. Now, by the way, the response to the debates about circumcision in the 19th century, interestingly enough, are exactly the same responses among many Jews as it was in the Hellenistic Middle East. Johann Friedrich Diefenbach notes the reintroduction of Celsus's decircumcision operation. He notes, one must understand me correctly. I present such methods in the Standard Handbook of Surgery of the 1840s only for their physiological surgical principles and to illustrate Celsus's idea of the extension of the prepuce of the foreskin out of luxury. I mean, this is lovely, right? Why would you do it? Luxury, belief, shame, or politics. It would be denigration of the art of surgery, and this analogy for me is absolutely striking given what happens in the 21st century. If in this manner, bachelors are created like virgins through the reconstruction of the hymen, about which one writer so pointedly said, a fine operation. Both are a morbid mockery of humanity from the practice of the Oriental slave trader. How do you make the bridegroom acceptable to the non-Jewish bride? He has decircumcision. How do you make in the 21st century, Muslim bride acceptable to her Muslim husband? Hymen reconstruction. We've not come much further than Diefenbach. Now, circumcision, as I've noted, when it becomes medicalized in these non-circumcising societies, becomes the treatment of the disease of the day, right? And in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, the disease of the day that have to do with the genitalia has to do with masturbation. We've heard about this before. But again, it's very interesting to read the medical literature. If you go to the Lancet, the great British medical journal, in the 1860s, you have a letter to the editor by Dr. Fowler. Has the operation of circumcision any effect in diminishing the habit or practice of onanism, of masturbation, among the male children and young lads of the Jewish community, he asks? Practicing, he says, in a neighborhood where this community abounds, the East End of London, I do not remember ever having had either a confessed or even a suspected case of this description among our Hebrew brethren. I wish I could say the same respecting juvenile Christians. Young Jewish men simply don't masturbate. Now, that's as powerful a fantasy as you can have about human sexuality, right? And they don't masturbate because they're circumcised. Because masturbation is a source of illness. Jews don't masturbate. They don't have all the illnesses of masturbation, unlike all these little gentle boys who run around going all day long, right? Now, this debate becomes a debate between Jews who understand circumcision now as medical prophylaxis within their status as physicians. This is Darwin's problem. I go to the Jewish scientist because the Jewish scientist is going to tell me about the accuracy of attitudes about circumcision because they know about circumcision. By the way, they don't know any more than anybody else. In this debate, in the British Medical Journal of the 1920s, Dr. Solomon from Ireland notes that most educated people ask to have their sons circumcised. Class, it helps in preventing masturbation. Circumcision is advised as a real help to the weakest spot in the human character. The ordinary schoolboy was not taught to keep himself clean. That is as lovely a euphemism as you're ever going to find, by the way. No anesthesia was necessary, of course, for infant male circumcision. In fact, it was harmful. Syphilis, he notes, is 5 times greater in the uncircumcised than the circumcised. But our friend Hastings Tweedy, who was the president of the section, noted that he doesn't really believe that circumcision reduces sexual desire. He doubts Solomon's figure about the prophylaxis against syphilis, and he had seen fatal cases in infant male circumcision, 3 from chloroform and 1 from hemorrhage. It's an interesting debate now, right? Will it protect you against those terrible diseases of masturbation and STIs, syphilis? This is the moment where syphilis and gonorrhea are now being teased apart. Or in point of fact, is it just another practice which may actually have negative medical sequelae in the operation itself? Now, we're starting to see a set of debates in non-circumcising societies which have now imported the philo question of, in these societies, one of the strongest arguments I can make for advocating for circumcision is, in point of fact, the health exception. Whatever else it is healthy to circumcise infant male children. But what do you do when you have new circumcising societies? We've been talking about the Jews as a kind of encapsulated circumcising society, but one of the things that happens in the course of the late 19th and 20th century is that the United States becomes a circumcising society. The American Medical Association introduces infant male circumcision broadly and argues that it is, the basis for it is not religious at all, of course. It is hygiene and prophylaxis against, surprise, surprise, syphilis and masturbation. And this becomes part of a kind of popular understanding of how do you have healthy babies, which is part of the eugenics movement, right? What we want to do, we nice, white, middle-class people who want to make sure that our white middle-class children continue to rule this country, we want to make sure that they're healthy, and already in the 1890s, the healthy baby books are advocating for infant male circumcision. So the United States becomes a circumcising society. Germany does not, Britain does not, France does not. Still very much a minority of circumcision undertaken in these societies in the course of the 20th century. But in the United States, then, the opposition to circumcision, right, the opposition to circumcision becomes something that is focused now on something which is a new post-World War II concept. It has its origins in claims about natural law, but it's really articulated first as a result, by the way, of the horrors of the Second World War. And that is the idea that infants have human rights. And these human rights are defined by medicine, and they stand in opposition to the notion of identity politics or communitarianism. The phrase that is used, it is coined by Anna Freud, who made annual trips to Yale in the 1950s and is the most important child psychoanalyst in the popular sphere in mid-century, is in the best interests of the child. And the best interests of the child have to do with the medical best interests of the child. So when you hear that phrase in the context of circumcision, it always has to do with the notion that being intact is healthier than not being intact. And so what we start to do is get notions which are very interesting to me because they cross this notion of health and gender, of the rape of the phallus. The best interest of the child does not admit to the health exceptions argued, for example, in the notion that it is a prophylaxis against other practices like masturbation and syphilis. After the Second World War, or the NHS, National Health Service, is created in Britain, circumcision, medical circumcision, not for medical reasons, but for prophylactic reasons, not for pathological reasons, but for prophylactic reasons, is introduced and then almost immediately dropped. Douglas Gardner was, who was one of the people who founded the NHS in 1949, was opposed to the NHS paying for and undertaking any form of circumcision. This is in a non-circumcising society in Great Britain because of the rate of death. Now, the rates of death that he cites, which are absolutely accurate, are from the use of general anesthesia, not from the circumcision itself, right? So again, this notion of the health exception is always introduced when you want to advocate for it, but it's also introduced when you want to advocate against it. Now, I mentioned earlier that by the end of the 20th century, the question of circumcision, or at least of the surgical or structural manipulation of the genitalia, has actually a different focus. And I'm not going to talk about it in detail today. It is the kind of obsession of Western feminism in the 1970s and 80s with female genital mutilation, and with the notion that female genital mutilation is, in point of fact, something which is inherently unhealthy. And by the way, and we can talk about this, female genital mutilation covers a very, very wide range of practices, from the removal of the clitoral hood, which is exactly equivalent to the removal of the foreskin, to total infibulation, the total destruction of the external genitalia, right? It's a wide set of practices. But what happens is that if you're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar with these debates. And we have this really interesting moment where we start to have, in the 21st century, a great opposition to bad communitarian practices based on Muslim practices of female genital mutilation. You can't defend this. It's terrible. And it's terrible because the Muslims do it. Now, we also know that it's a subset of Muslims, but that isn't the argument that's used. And then there is an extraordinary moment. I love this moment because you knew it had to happen. Once you move from the Jews to the Muslims, once you move from little boys to little girls, somebody who is making the argument against Muslim practices is going to say, but these Muslims also mutilate little boys. And of course, who else could it be but Hirsi Ali? I mean, you almost have to invent her, right? And in 2004, she comes out very strongly. She's still a member of the Dutch Parliament against infant male circumcision. Dead silence. All of the liberals, especially the Jewish community in Holland, which loved her attacks on the Muslims, suddenly say, wait a minute. But of course, she's been completely consistent. They're not. She is. By the way, within a week, she withdraws this opposition. She's only interested in little girls, not in little boys. So one of the things we start to see in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 20th century is this argument, which had to do with Jewish exceptionalism and the debates about circumcision, start to, through first of all with female genital mutilation, start to move from the Jews as a community to Muslims as a community. And by the way, you do understand that these are constructed communities. They're in the eyes of the beholder, right? In the UK, the NHS simply refuses any support for circumcision. But the Scots decide, because anything the British don't do, the Scots figure they've got to do, right? I mean, it's one of these interesting knee-jerk problems, is that the Scots are willing to fund ritual circumcision, right? Not circumcision to remedy pathology, but ritual circumcision within the hospital setting. So circumcision becomes now completely medicalized, but paid for. In 1999, the Muslims are brought before the court in Britain, way before Cologne. The court said that in regard to J, that circumcision in Britain required the consent of all those with parental responsibility or the permission of the court, and now, surprise, surprise, acting for the best interests of the child. And the court prohibited the circumcision of a male child, of a non-practicing Muslim father, and a non-practicing Christian mother in custody. Why? And this is why this is so complicated. Not because they're not practicing their religion, not because the child should be intact, but because there's medical risk. The operation might irreversibly reduce sexual pleasure by permanently removing some sensory nerves. Even those cosmetic foreskin restoration might be possible. Now you get this whole history. In other words, it never goes away. We're back, right, to Celsus. We're back to Hellenism. We're back to the notion of being intact is better than not being intact, but now with this very careful medical rationale. And this appears then in 2011 in California. In other words, this is not simply a problem. And it is a problem raised in San Francisco, where there is a proposal to ban to make it unlawful to circumcise, excise, cut, or mutilate the whole or any part of the foreskin, testicles, or penis of anyone 17 years or younger in the city. And as my colleagues have mentioned in the introduction, the immediate response to this anti-circumcision move in San Francisco is to see it as an attack on both Muslims and Jews, best articulated now by David Wolpe, one of the leading conservative rabbis in Los Angeles, who notes that some involved are simply opposed to religion, some wish to target both Muslims and Jews, but can anyone doubt that anti-circumcision advocates who seize on this as a chance to hurt Jews and the Jewish tradition? You see the problems now. You have a scientific argument against. You have to then think about why you are circumcising. Wolpe says it's tradition, but it's tradition with very complicated implications. What happens in California is that the state legislature makes it impossible for these types of laws to be promulgated. They, in a sense, protect infant male circumcision and make it as a statement of state desire that infant male circumcision be permitted. It is against the law to remove the cover of the clitoris of a little girl in California, but it is against the law to forbid anyone from removing the foreskin. Right? So we're in an interesting moment. Cologne, and you know this case better than I, June 26th, it is a Muslim parent who is accused that circumcisions, in point of fact, cause illegal bodily harm to the children, and the child's right to physical integrity supersedes parents' rights and the freedom of religion. And the German pediatric associations, the Dachverband der Kinder- und Jugendmedizinische Gesellschaften, support the German court ruling as violating bodily integrity, which is a notion of health, and putting through the practice itself the child's health at risk. And again, you know that the immediate response was, this is an attack on the Jews. What's fascinating, of course, is that it's not, of course. It's an attack on Muslim religious practice, read in Germany as Jewish religious practice, but read in California in the same way. Read in California in exactly the same way. And it is seen, interestingly enough, as part of a general attack on religion. The French ban on the Muslim face covering, the Swiss ban on minarets, and now the attempt to ban infant male circumcision is, in point of fact, seen as a moment of the coalescing of Jewish and Muslim interests. But if you start to look at the Cologne finding, what's very interesting is that religious circumcisions are deemed illegal because, as I've said, they violate the child's right to physical integrity and self-determination. But, and I'm going to stress the but, the court differentiated such acts from the instances when a circumcision is medically necessary. And you know, once you start to make that distinction, right, you're in a wonderful world of ambiguity. This is the law. Right? We have the same problem in the United States with abortion. When we talk about abortion based on the health of the mother, we mean the psychic health of the mother? We mean the physical health of the mother? What do we mean by the health of the mother? Right? What happens is when you start to think of medical necessities, well, it'll stop the little boy from masturbating. I've got a whole medical literature on that. So is it possible? Well, that's an interesting set of questions. So the federal law in Germany, while trying to avoid the provisions for religious circumcision, anchors the legislation in the rights of children to avoid requiring steps to determine the motivation of the parents' decision to have their children circumcised. We don't ask why they're doing it. They can do it, but there's always the health exception. There's always the health exception. Now, the health exception seems to have an important sort of advocate with the Centers for Disease Control. We now have widespread advocacy of public health authorities in the United States, World Health Organization, to use adult male circumcision as a prophylaxis against the heterosexual spread of HIV/AIDS. There's been major work done on this in Africa. It has a clearly political bias. I'm happy to talk about that. But the CDC comes out and says you should absolutely circumcise young boys. We're doing it with adults because it reduces the rate of HIV/AIDS infection. HIV/AIDS infection in Africa is the masturbation of the 20th century. All right? The reality, of course, is that it doesn't. Good studies of these very, very complicated PEPFAR proposals to use circumcision show that, in point of fact, it doesn't actually have the effect. But then you would say to yourself, okay, look, if it really does have that effect in Africa, that's a good kind of a test case. Well, we should advocate it for those reasons in the United States. And the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which is a federal agency, actually had proposed what is called a notice of universal circumcision. It was on their website. We're going to advocate for this. And suddenly somebody looked and said, oh, wait a minute. We're going to argue that all infant males in the United States should be circumcised for medical reasons, and we don't have the evidence for it. So what they did, it was on the website for a month, and now if you read the website, it says, the user has elected to delete their account and the content is no longer available. CDC is no longer advocating for universal infant male circumcision because in point of fact, it is very problematic to use these statistics about health improvement in Africa and make them global. But it didn't stop in 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics, exactly opposite of the German Academy, to reverse their stand on infant male circumcision and advocate for it because it reduces the risk of a whole range. And this shopping list sounds like every 19th century shopping list about the advocacy of any prophylaxis. It will lower risks of HIV, genital herpes, HPV, syphilis, rate of penile cancer, reduces the risk of cervical cancer in sexual partners, lowers the risk of urinary tract infections in the first year. Now, I'm going to end because this is a serious group of people who looked at all of the medical literature advocating for, and remember, what happens when you take a religious practice and you medicalize it is you've got a type of evidence now used to advocate for a practice for a totally different reason than the practice was introduced. American Pediatric Association said, you got to do it. It's going to reduce all kinds of diseases. And just recently, and because it's the good thing about real science is that these debates actually take place. In 2013, a group of Western European pediatricians and epidemiologists looked at this finding and said, and I'm going to end with this quote, "Seen from the outside, cultural bias reflecting the normality of non-therapeutic male circumcision in the United States seems obvious." In other words, circumcising societies in the 21st century have to advocate for the health exception. And the report's conclusions are different from those reached by physicians in other parts of the Western world where we don't have circumcising societies, including Europe, Canada, and Australia. Non-US based physicians and their representatives of general medical associations and societies for pediatrics, pediatric surgery, and pediatric urology in Northern Europe see that only one of the arguments pulled forward by the American Academy of Pediatrics has some theoretical relevance in relationship to infant male circumcision, namely the possible protection against urinary tract infections in infant boys, which can easily be treated with antibiotics without tissue loss. Is there a possibility of resolving this? No. No. That's why I want to stress. I started out by saying this is a historical problem of circumcising groups and non-circumcising groups coming in conflict and trying to provide rationales for an act which, in point of fact, is a religious ritual. What you will find over time is that you will find evidence on both sides of the health exception, but it is evidence not for the epidemiological, for the medical, but for the communitarian aspects. Why do the majority of parents in the United States circumcise their little boys? Certainly not a religious reason, even though Muslims and Jews indeed circumcise their infant boys. If you do a poll, and it's been done, the answer is because I want Johnny to look like Daddy. That is the answer in a circumcising society. And everything else is used as evidence to make that rationale. It is the argument of a communitarian notion of circumcision using the health exception. I thank you very much.